It's springtime right now, and there are a lot of days when I just want to be outside. Right now, I'm on my back porch drawing some of the most common things that you see out in nature around here. Just some regular old dandelions. And all I'm using are a very common art supply, which is Crayola crayons. Starting out, just marking roughly, not measuring or anything, but marking where I see the dandelions with yellow, and then giving them a little bit orange in the heart or center where the petals are more dense and you get that rich orange shadow. Drawing from real life, especially outside, is a wonderful exercise that will make you stronger as an artist and will just give you opportunity to work in a way that is spontaneous and exciting and will teach you a lot about seeing the world the way that you want to see it and translating that into whatever your unique personal style is as an artist. And as you can see by what I'm doing here, you don't have to go anywhere special or go very far from home to be able to do this. If you have a porch, if you have a backyard or a front yard, if you can get to a park of any kind, or even look at your neighborhood and your block. Look at the buildings and the trees and so forth that you see every day. Do they look kind of boring to you? Try looking at them at different times of day and seeing if there's something that stands out. The very act of trying to look close to home and see what catches your eye and is interesting to you as a subject will enhance, in my experience, your vision of how beautiful the things around you might be, even in ways that you don't necessarily expect or ways that are unconventional. So, starting with the green on the dandelions, again, I'm not measuring things exactly or trying to capture a photographic image of what's in front of my eyes, but I'm looking at what is interesting in the plants to me, the shapes, the movement, and I'm trying to just fill in a general silhouette of the shape with 1 or 2 shades of green at first. I recommend pressing pretty gently on your crayons as you're starting out here, because some of those lighter looking spots may end up being your highlights to indicate where the sun is hitting the leaves. I'm putting in a couple of little violets that are in the cluster of flowers. Can't really see them on the camera too well. And it can be useful to test out your colors on the side of your paper on a scrap piece of paper before you get in. But I'm beginning to add some shadows now. And those shadows are going to tell me, and hopefully the viewer of my picture, if I do my job well, where the light is falling on the leaves, which ones are closer to us and which ones are further away, and what their shape is. You can really keep things as impressionistic as you want here. You could look mostly just at colors and say, there are going to be yellow blobs here, there are going to be green blobs here. I'm going to try to capture the greens really accurately. If you want to put in more fine details of things like the stem of the flowers and so forth, that doesn't mean that the same level of detail has to be everywhere. You can really put that in the places where you want your viewer to linger. And then I'm just going to put in some of the brown for the ground there to sort of show where the dandelions are growing from. And because it's a darker color, it's also going to make them pop out more towards the front of the page right away. Now, the dandelions are the focal point or the center of the image that I'm making here. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the shadow that they cast, in the ground around them, and all sorts of dried leaves and twigs and little bits of dirt on the ground, and the pebbly texture of the concrete that they're growing out of. Remember that you don't have to literally draw all of those things out one by one, like every scrap of dry leaf, to give people the impression that they're there. So see if you can try out a few different ways of scribbling and making dots and patterns, or mixing your colors to create the illusion or the effect or texture of that ground and that stone and concrete. If you look at any individual dandelion plant or handful of dirt, pile of dry leaves, they're all going to have a lot of stuff in there, different shapes and little bits and things, and each individual one is going to be different. So this is true, in my opinion, all the time in art, but in this case even more so. There's really no single right or wrong way to do it at all. If you aren't used to drawing in nature, it can be a little bit weird and daunting at first, because if what you're used to is drawing from photographs, things out in nature will move in the wind. They are also just three-dimensional, so unless you can stay clamped perfectly still somehow, which I wouldn't recommend anyways, then the angle will change subtly and things may suddenly look very different from the way you thought they looked before, and the light will change. But really, I think it's such a worthwhile learning experience, the being able to see things in 3D and turn around and see all the different sides and then decide which part you're going to draw and how that 3D nature of the thing will inform your final drawing, even though the drawing is 2D. All of that is so useful, and it's useful even if you have no intention of being a realistic artist at all. If depicting just drawings of flowers or whatever is completely different from your goals, because if you sit with things closely and you just look at them and pay attention, then you are going to notice and observe things that you would not find if you were just looking at your expectations or your imagination as your sole source of info about the world. And you can take that unexpected information, that new perspective on the world, and use it to create something completely abstract, like just take the colors or the weird pointy shapes of the dandelion leaves and use that as the basis of just some wild, funky pattern, and that's going to enrich your work and enrich your spirit in ways that you can't predict. And you can tell that the moment I get outside, I get real philosophical, so please bear with me. Getting back down to earth, you can see that I filled in a lot of shadows around the dandelions. They're very distinct dark areas on the vertical sides of the step there, the concrete step, and also underneath it and underneath the dandelions cast by those things. And I challenge you to be bold and decisive when filling in those shadows. Putting in those big blocky areas of one color, especially if it's dark and you can't really take it back, can be kind of intimidating, but it adds a lot to your image to have those solid areas of like deep shadow, because again it just like pops everything else forward. am doing the same sort of thing in miniature with the leaves, really looking at a lot of them have this sort of beautiful effect from the bright sunshine of being half in light and half in shadow, just from the little crease on the middle of the leaf. And then some leaves are just very dark against their neighbor leaves that are much more well lit. So starting to fill in the dark areas and the little, whatever the guy is called, at the base of the flower, that green area that's holding the petals. All of those start to add a little bit more of a 3D feeling to our patch of dandelions. These guys have like a million petals, so I'm also just taking my orange and making these little like cartoon sun rays, these dots radiating in and out from the center of the flower to give the illusion of it having like that fluffy dandelion, many-petaled volume. When you're getting into your leaves and things like that, one thing that's useful to remember is there are so many different shades of green in nature, even in the same one plant or one area. And if you're using a big set of crayons, then you will probably have a lot of different green crayons available to you. And I would definitely recommend looking on the side of your paper or scrap material or something and testing out those different greens and seeing what feels right, because there's kind of cold bluish ones and warm, more like yellowish or orangish ones. And if you don't have that many colors, try experimenting with adding the blues or browns or even reds or oranges into your green and mixing them together and seeing what happens. Because if you just use greens that are all sort of in the same color range but just lighter or darker, you will have a very different sense of depth and dimension in your picture than if you use a wide variety of hues and tones and temperatures of green. Because of that same idea, I also like to add different colors to my shadow areas. In this case, I think I'm going to go with things like kind of deep blue and violet that'll blend into the brown and gray, and it's just going to make those shadows look more real and dimensional and mysterious under there. In these videos, I like to show my process and sort of the steps and approaches that work for me, but I am not interested in going step by step in a really rigid way, because everybody's approach is going to be different, and what works for you and what looks good to you should be different than what it is for me. And especially for these videos out in nature, you're going to see something different than what I see. And you're also going to translate what you see very differently through the lens of your sight and your hands and your sort of creative voice that comes from inside of you and your experiences in the world. When I'm working with something like crayon, I like to, as much as possible, look at things as big blocks of lighter and darker colors. So you see that I have some leaves outlined, but rather than trying to keep them as outlines, I like to look at, where is there a big dark shape that's like the dark half of a leaf, or the shadow underneath the whole cluster of dandelions on the concrete. But you might like to try starting with a really bold outline and seeing what sort of effect you get there. I would love to see that. If you do something based on any of these videos, whatever your approach, whether you try to test out my techniques or do something completely your own different way, I really hope that you'll share it with us on the social media, because I would be thrilled to see other people's contributions. So I would say at this point the image is really starting to come together and look like what it's going to be in the end, or give us the first hints of that anyways. And as you can probably see from the video so far, I really like doing an approach most of the time where I start out very general, like filling in big shapes for everything, and then in this way that's sort of like circling around, like going over the whole thing in these tightening circles where I'm trying to touch every part at once, and as I go in further and closer, oh, those are opposites, aren't they? As I keep going, I'm adding increasing levels of detail to each section and then kind of circling around and doing it the same. It's like kind of like dealing a hand of cards to a bunch of people when you're playing Uno. Like you give everyone one and you give everyone two and so forth. And again, that's just one approach. I don't think any way is better or worse than another necessarily. There's no hard and fast rule about that. But what I like about this approach is, to some extent, you can kind of stop at any time. Like if it starts raining, this is especially useful if you're outside, because outside is less predictable than inside often. You know, if you have to stop before you plan to, then you'll still have something that gives a pretty good impression of the entire scene or frame that you were trying to draw. So like if I had to stop right now, I would be reasonably happy that I had represented broadly what I wanted to represent, and that can also make it easier for you to go back and finish that later if you have to. On the other hand, it can also be really interesting to say, like, I'm going to look at this one dandelion, my favorite dandelion out of this patch, and just go right in on that and depict that with the most loving and careful amount of detail, and then move on to the rest of the patch of flowers or everything around it. What I would say about that sort of approach is it'll probably be pretty obvious that that's what you did, because unless you just have tons of time and are very meticulous and patient about it, if you start with putting a whole bunch of detail and attention to one thing, then it'll be more tricky to match that really well with the rest of the image. So that one thing that you start with in that intense way will probably really come to the forefront of your drawing as the thing that you are focusing on, which there's nothing wrong with that. It can be really cool. So again, I think what I really want to give you, what I want you to come away with when you watch these and listen to me, is that it's worth trying all sorts of different ways of working and seeing which ones are rewarding and exciting for you. Actually, that reminds me, a useful tip from me to you is, in case you have to stop unexpectedly or before you want to, it can be a good idea to take a photo of the thing you're drawing with your phone or something like that from about the same angle as you're drawing it from, and then you can always have the option of using the photo as a reference to finish it indoors or at a later time. You're also completely free to just decide to stop in the middle of a drawing and come back to it later. That can feel scary if you're drawing outside because of what I talked about earlier, how easily things change, so it's true that you might not be able to come back to something that looks exactly like it did the exact day or time you were drawing it in the beginning. But that doesn't have to be a bad thing. You can always use the reality that you see in front of you just as a starting point and finish it completely from your imagination. Like map in the beginning of the dandelion patch and then say, well, how do I want it to look in the end? And decide for yourself instead of just following the evidence in front of your eyes. Or say, if you start your picture of some dandelions outside on a Monday and then you have to stop and you can't get back to it for whatever reason until Wednesday the same week, instead of trying to make it look like that didn't happen and just finishing the image as neatly as possible, you could make a picture of dandelions that's also a little bit about time travel. Like, for example, make it look like a double exposure photograph where the old version and the new version of the dandelions, whatever changes may have happened over that day or two, are overlapping each other in some way. Or, that's just one option. There are so many interesting things you can do if you just sort of open yourself up to different possibilities and don't focus on what you think the rules of the drawing should be or what the artwork should look like, but what you can do, which is really anything. That's the great thing about art. So you can see that I filled in a lot of the space behind the dandelions now. And I've also added shadows and some light outlines to a lot of the leaves to help emphasize their really distinctive shape. But for the dandelions, I did mostly try to use the darker colors behind them to show the fluffy shape of the flowers themselves. Because they're so light, that really beautiful yellow color that they have, in my opinion, for the picture I'm drawing, putting a big outline around them would potentially take away from that. So that's why I tried to let the shadows and the color of the concrete and the green row of plants growing along the edge of that step do the work for me of showing what the dandelions look like in contrast to them. This is a good time to look for spaces that may have gotten less attention and may look less finished than others that are near them, and to also see if you've put in a color, a tone of green, a darker shadow somewhere, if you can sort of spread that around to help unify your picture. I'm getting closer to being done here, and of course when you're done with your picture is really up to you and will become a lot easier to decide on the more you do. It's definitely something that gets easier with practice, because I think when I was starting out and still really learning everything that I was doing, that was one of the biggest stumbling blocks for me, is like, how do I know when I'm done? Should I keep working on this? And of course, if you're still learning, often you won't necessarily be satisfied with what you're doing right away. But I think we're nearing a stopping point. This is a really good time to look carefully at your picture and then at your model, the thing you're drawing from, and see what stands out to you. What do you like? Are they similar? Are you capturing what you want to capture, and so forth? And let that guide the way you finish your picture, the last steps that you take. So I'm starting to go out towards the corners of my paper and fill in more of the stuff around the dandelions and the plants. And also continuing to deepen some shadows, building up that whole scene. There's the shadow of the side of the next step up, which really don't see much of in the picture, but I wanted to include it anyways. Just going and darkening that side of the step and the shadow under the dandelions as well. And I'm starting to go in with this sort of indigo blue color to darken the deepest shadows in the patch of dandelions itself and really pop out the areas that I think have the highest contrast in real life, or that I want to have the highest contrast in my picture. Because I think this is definitely the point where, still observing the real thing in front of me, I'm turning to think a little bit more about what I want my finished drawing to look like instead of just what I'm seeing. And that blue helps make everything look brighter and more three-dimensional in comparison. On clear days, sunlight tends to be kind of yellow or orange in hue where it falls on things. So the shadows that it casts will, in contrast, be kind of bluish or purplish. And the color of light and shadow areas in your pictures is going to change when drawing from real life, depending on whether you're indoors, what kind of lighting there is, if you're outdoors, if it's cloudy. But it's a really good thing to remember and look out for when you're observing things in real life, that the color that things actually are, what is called the local color, isn't the only color that you are most likely going to see. So if you have a bunch of green leaves or plants and you only use green to draw them, then oftentimes they actually will look less real than if you include other colors that are created by the shadows and the sunlight that's falling on them. Or not necessarily sunlight, whatever kind of light it is. But I am putting those blues and purples and spots on my picture, and I think it's adding a lot of drama and mystique in addition to just making it more dimensional. As we wrap up here, another piece of advice: if you do find yourself struggling to know when your picture is done, I would recommend setting yourself a time limit and maybe even setting a timer or alarm on your phone and just making yourself stop at the point when the timer goes off. Try different amounts of time, because it can be really useful to see how far you can take a drawing in just 15, 10, 5 minutes, in addition to doing the longer ones like this one. It'll really show you new things about your process and what you see first as well. And if you have drawn something today following one of my videos, please share it with us. We're on Instagram at Createch SPPL, and around the rest of the internet at some other places too, which I don't know off the top of my head. So that can be a fun scavenger hunt for you to track us down. Thank you so much for watching my video, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Oh, I just remembered that I was also going to tell you to get up and stretch and drink water at certain points in your drawing and not just sit there the whole time, but I realized that would be a little bit more convincing if I had done it myself, so tune in next time to see if I remember. Bye.